I'm going to take us all over the place, high tone, low tone, from serious literature to modern musicals, because I thought that we should try and touch on all the different ways Jews do Pesach and think about Pesach, but also through literary sources. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint um, and say this is kind of where I started. I was looking for a photograph just to go on the front. And actually, I took a photograph from us laying the table for our own Seder at home. You can see the jumping frog nameplate that my friend's 7-year-old made with my name on, which was very lovely. I'm using a brand new Haggadah that was published just 3 weeks ago, illustrated by a friend of mine. But we've also got all the traditional foods and the traditional sauces. And that kind of mixture of kind of the picture of levels, the illustration and art, and the absolute tradition is what Seder is all about. And it's kind of what today is all about. Like, how do we combine all of what Pesach is in an hour? And an hour that takes us through a ritualized order. So, if I start, and let's just check that my PowerPoint is actually going to work. There we go. I thought my key text should be my crazy ex-girlfriend. So I was looking for a Pesach scene and I couldn't find one. But I thought this bar mitzvah song speaks to not just Pesach, but what Jewish ritual is all about perfectly. So let's have a start with Remember That We Suffered.
Now it's time to celebrate. Grab a drink and fix a plate. But before you feel too great, remember that we suffered. Nights like these are filled with glee. Noshing, dancing, singing. We sing in a minor key to remember that we suffered. Remember that we suffered. You have no idea what pain is. Remember that we suffered. I mean, would it be such a crime for the Beastie Boys or Haim to mention in their songs one time, remember that we suffered? I don't want to bring up the Holocaust. I know the Holocaust, but the Holocaust was a really big deal. Remember that we suffered. Today is horrific. Remember that we suffered.
My grandma's a survivor. She suffered.
Right then, and Hitler. Remember that we suffered. And we mentioned Hitler. I'm just saying that we suffered.
When I say we, you say suffer. We. I can't hear you.
Oops. So we love that, right? Remember that we suffered the bitter and the sweet. Streisand, well, we're not quite doing Streisand, but Patti LuPone and Tove Felsche would do. All the way to Hitler, there will be a tiny bit of Holocaust here. And that's one way of taking on the kind of literary and cultural background. But there's another that is much more kind of beautiful and transcendent. So I'm going to kind of set my crazy ex-girlfriend against Marge Piercy, whose songs we join in are beeswax candles burning with no smoke, a clean fire licking at the evening, our voices small flames quivering. The songs string us like beads on the hour. The ritual is its own melody that leads us where we have gone before and hope to go again. The comfort of year after year. Order. We must touch each base of the Haggadah as we pass. Blessing, hand washing, dipping this and that. Voices half harmonize on the brochas. Dear faces, like a multitude of moons, hang over the table. and the truest brief blessing, affection and peace that we make. So on the one hand, we have the craziness, the noise and the suffering and the joy. On the other hand, we have the comfort of ritual. And I thought it was rather beautiful and optimistic that way. And also that she leads it to that this is a blessing of peace. So I'm going to return to Marge Piercy a little bit later on. But I wanted to take those two opposite things as the touchstones for the evening, both the suffering and the comfort, the sadness and the optimism. And also point out that this line, the dear faces like a multitude of moons hang over the table. So when I said that I would do today, I gave a title to Callie and to Shirelle, which was from Marjorie Morningstar to Chava Alberstein. And we are going to do both of those texts, I promise you. But I happen to be teaching on a day when we are trapped between the optimism and the joy of the moon crossing last night, which seems to me all about future. And possibly that is what we are crossing the Red Sea into. And then on the other hand, we have all this concern with what is going to happen based on the Strait of Hormuz. And I put strait because Mitzrayim, Egypt, is actually the narrow place. It's a place between the straits. That is literally the meaning of the name. So we're doing both. And to try and kind of get the sense of touchstones and bases, I've taken the number 4 and we're going to do 4 locations if I can time this right. So as we go through our literary sources, we're going to start with the moon. We're going to do a little bit of England, which is where I'm from, a little bit of America, which is where I believe most of you are, and finish in Israel, which is both the promised land and at the moment quite a straitened place, quite a difficult place to live. So we will do all those with some Marjorie Morningstar and ending with Chava Alberstein. But let's start with the moon because that's just happened. So, location 1. This was the picture from NASA last night, the far side of the solar eclipse, which I thought was rather amazing. And it reminded me as I was listening to them talk about this crossing that they were doing, because it was ridiculous o'clock in London, but I still had the news on watching it. So apologies if I'm a little bit tired. But I kept thinking of this poem, which obviously is based on the story of the Haggadah, the leaving Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea. It's a very tiny poem by Aryeh Sivan, and actually I've brought it because it is small. I'm only going to do small texts in Hebrew, but I thought being poetry, it's pointed and it's quite short. We'll do it in both, which is Midei Boker Adam Mitorer al Sfato Shal Yam Hamachar V'shoel et atzmo Lechatzot or lo lechatzot. So each morning a person gets up on the shore of tomorrow's sea and asks himself to cross or not to cross. Seemed very fitting, and it seemed a question worth thinking about because we very much are on the shore of tomorrow's sea. And that each morning, midday boker, Adam, a human being, really. This is the translation of Lisa Katz, and she's gone for a person. So Hebrew is a gendered language, but it really is Adam. It's the kind of human, that the human condition is to constantly getting up, seeing what comes next, and asking oneself whether or not to take that step. So to cross or not to cross, lachtzot or lo lachzot. And I'm pointing that out because it's going to take me to the next poem. That is the Moses poem, right? And actually, it was Miriam, really, who takes them through and takes them to cross. But this is not just a biblical or a Haggadic reflection for Aryeh Sivan, but for every single one of the writers that we are looking at, they use the Haggadah, they use the story of the Exodus to reflect on their own condition and their own life. So Aryeh Sivan is a poet, but like so many Hebrew poets, this is how Amichai described himself. He was a poet soldier. So he fought in the War of Independence, he was a member of the Palmach, and then he studied Hebrew language and literature. And Yehuda Amichai, who I will come to towards the end, kind of talked about this for the poets of Israel as kind of the traitor's role. He compared himself and other poets to Josephus, that you're in the situation, you're fighting for your people, but then it's the moment when you're not fighting anymore that you write the history. But writing that history and writing that moment and that life, particularly when you're doing so in a language that will be translated out of Hebrew, is kind of exposing your world to the others, and it's making a comment on a point in time. So Amichai asked himself, and he asked kind of all poets of Israel, is the act of writing kind of the same as the act of fighting? It's going to war for your country, or is it the opposite gesture? Is it either traitorous or building the act of peace? So I think these questions and this question that Aryeh Sivan is asking, for him, the morning was, am I going to be a teacher and a writer, or am I going to be fighting? That was a very, very alive question to ask each morning. The poem reminded me actually of another poet soldier, a slightly younger one, and that's Avraham Khalafi. And this is another Little Moon tribute. Let's do it in English first, with a handful of heaven. With a handful of heaven in my hand, I would pass my life. I would cross the sea by foot with a handful of heaven in my hand. And this was, the repetition is because this is a poem, but also a song. So many of Khalfi's poems were turned into songs, in fact, turned almost into anthems at the beginning of the creation of the State of Israel. And if we look at it in Hebrew, im kometz shamayim bayad, that holding the heavens in one's hand, hayiti over et chayai, that is how you are when you are crossing over et chayai, crossing your life. So like Aryeh, Avraham Khalfi is going to use the verb for cross of chotzeh, which is the literal word to cross. But he's also put in here, I will cross my life, or I will pass my life, pass over, is how Lisa Katz has translated it. And of course, that over is the word for Ivrit or Hebrew, or I am a Hebrew. Jonah says it, Ani Ivri, it's how Avraham describes himself. They were the ones who crossed over the Jordan River. But also that crossing over, which links to Passover and passing over, can also be transgression. On Yom Kippur, we talk about it as an Avera. So when is that act of crossing a positive thing and a step to freedom? And when is it a transgression? And what does it mean as a human being that he's imagining humans as holding heaven? Normally it's the other way around, right? God's the one with the mighty hand and the outstretched arm. So there's all this playing with tropes. And just to give you a little bit of background to him, he was born in Wouk in Poland. He studied in Ukraine, arrived in Israel in 24, so that's how he survived. He was one of that pioneer generation who worked in agriculture and construction before joining the Workers' Theatre. And as I said, he became very key as not just a poet, but a songwriter. But of course, look at those dates. You know, he like Ariel Sivan fought in the War of Independence, but also, although he came and some members of his family, many who remained in Poland did not survive the Holocaust. So that crossing the sea is absolutely key for him. You know, the decision he made to cross the sea was what gave him life. Um, so that all these kind of writings using this kind of Exodus metaphor is, of course, a writing about oneself and one's own condition. So I'm going to cross the sea, cross transatlantically to England, but also come from the moon to land. Let's come to Earth for a little bit. I thought I'd bring you a little bit of London. Um, so I have a contemporary of Chalfis, um, who is a very famous Jewish British writer, maybe not so famous in America, but his name is Israel Zangwill. Um, he should be more famous in America than he is, because I don't know if you know that whole concept of America as the melting pot society. The melting pot is actually taken from Zangwill. He had a play, The Melting Pot, which was all about actually a young woman wrestling with tradition. In fact, if I remember correctly, there is a Seder scene within it, but it might be a Shabbat scene. She's at the table, but she chooses to leave in search of the golden in Medina. And she's also kind of wrestling between a kind of very static, kind of traditional version of a Jewish life and the young modern life that she wants. Um, before he wrote The Melting Pot, he'd written a series called Children of the Ghetto, which were basically the Jewish Dickens stories. They're comparable in period and in style of writing. But he has an awakening. He becomes secular. He marries a non-Jewish woman, and she is a suffragette, and he becomes basically the leader of the male suffragettes. He's often doing panels with people like the Pankhurst family, advocating for women's rights to vote. And then he will go on to champion the rights for Jews to have a state. But he goes on a whole journey. He becomes part of a group called the Wanderers of Kilburn. But he's one of the people who advocates for Uganda. So he starts off by advocating for Israel, goes there, visits there, and realizes that there's already people there. And in fact, the line that he created, which again we hear a lot and no one attributes to him, which is a land without a people for a people without a land, that is Zangwill. Um, he withdraws it. He pulls it back very quickly because on his first visit, he's befriended by Herzl when Herzl visits England. He goes on a visit and he realizes there are other people there. He switches tack, but his kind of polemics already been taken up by the Zionist cause. He then advocates the Uganda solution, which is also problematic. That ain't a land without a people either, and we don't have our history there. But he's this really interesting person who his Jewishness is at the height at the centre of his advocacy and his political kind of will, whether he's advocating for those in poverty with his children of the ghetto, advocating for the suffragettes or for a melting pot society, or talking about Zionism as an early Zionist. So this is his World War One poem. So he is writing about Seder night in World War One, and I thought from the moon that contrast and that kind of richness of Piercy and the heaven-filled hands of our Israeli poets, Zangwill is very British, maybe even very English, and very prosaic. So prosaic miles of streets stretch all around, astir with restless, hurried life, and spanned by arches that with thunderous trains resound, and throbbing wires that galvanize the land. Gin palaces in tawdry splendour stand, the newsboys shriek of mangled bodies found. The last burlesque is playing in the Strand. In modern prose, all poetry seems drowned. Yet, In 10,000 homes this April night, an ancient people celebrates its birth to freedom with a reverential mirth, with customs quaint and many a hoary rite, waiting until its tarnished glories bright, its God shall be the God of all the earth. So I thought this was kind of remarkable. First of all, it's a sonnet. So those of you who've been with me when I've been teaching Shakespeare, which is more my more my usual mode, will recognise the form, and it is a Shakespearean sonnet actually, although he's tweaked slightly the sestet, the rhyme scheme. But he's a Shakespeare sonnet with an octet and a sestet, so eight, two verses of four making up an eight, and then a volta, a turn. That yet is his volta. Yet. Here is my England. Oops. Here is my England. My England is prosaic, or even my London is prosaic miles of streets. My London is thunderous trains, the throbbing electric wires that have recently galvanized the land and brought electricity, but also now carry the news. You know, we're in the early days of radio. The newsboys shriek of mangled bodies. That we're in World War One. There's the burlesque happening in the Strand. Modern prose poetry is drowned. He's writing this as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and Virginia Woolf are creating modernism, but he's hanging on to the traditional forms. And he's saying, that's what's happening in London. This is modern London. And yet, this April night, 10,000 homes, I think he's underestimating even, and ancient people are celebrating. And I love that with a reverential mirth, that our humour does both things. And this is so interesting to me because simultaneously with him writing kind of The Melting Pot and other plays where he's kind of almost throwing away and advocating the modern world himself, here he is going, but on Pesach, those quaint customs and hoary, those old-fashioned like grey-haired rites are what bring kind of God, you know. And again, tarnished glories, he loves him, an oxymoron. Kind of, this is still my belief that it's God, kind of the God of my ancient people, kind of will believe that God shall be God of all the earth. So I thought I'd take us from Seder night in World War One in a sonnet to another Seder night in London, but this one is 2020, and this is another Seder night in a sonnet. So this is my friend Jacqueline Safra. So Jackie is a very well-known poet here. I would say, she is probably of the contemporary British poets the most known in the secular world. She's been shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, and she writes always going back to form and always celebrating her Jewish culture. So here is her sonnet. During lockdown, she wrote a sonnet a day, and they were then published. And here is her sonnet for the first night of Passover. And she's given it two epigraphs. One is, this Passover, the Seder is virtual, the plague is real, which I thought was rather brilliant from CNN. But also at that time, April 2021, we thought in Britain we were losing all our Jewish press. Both the Jewish Chronicle and Jewish News were going into liquidation. Actually, I can now tell you 5, 6 years later, they've both been saved. And also my magazine, fortunately, is thriving. But it was in this moment of, is there going to be a Jewish tradition in this country? And yet the plagues are real, and here we are celebrating Pesach on screen. And her Seder plate has blue birds on it, which is why you'll see the last line. So we gather round the plate, its song of songs, the history of birds on lilt and loop of leaf and bloom, a blue of painted spring to celebrate millennia of hope against erasure. Did I say we gather? Each in our little space, we make a grid of faces. I feel I've loved you all forever. For now, this is the closest we can get. We work our shaky melody, we bear the weight of memory, and just for now, we're not alone. The plagues are everywhere. We tell it straight. We truly know it now. We fill our lungs, inhale some joy, exhale a kind of unison, singing with blue birds on a china plate. So I thought it was rather beautiful in its speaking to the modern condition. And of course, all of us on this screen in our little boxes today know exactly what she's talking about and that communication across worlds. Again, she is talking to hope here. And for her, Pesach is millennia of hope against erasure. So I thought that was a very, very important message for the moment. But I couldn't believe 104 years between we have two Jewish poets writing sonnets about Seder night. So that was my little bit of literary London. I thought I'd take us next, though, to your side of the Atlantic. So to America, or the Golden Medina, where Israel Zangwill thought there was hope. In his vision, all us Jews, not just from Europe, but from England, would be making our way to America too. And in fact, all my father's family, apart from him and my grandfather, did exactly that. So I feel very split between the countries, or transatlantic myself. And I'm going to go back to Marge Piercy for a moment. I'm keeping it somewhat contained because I realise I have enough Pesach poems to do, about 6 different Pesach sessions. So I thought we'll have some focus this time and maybe you'll have me back another year and we'll explore some others. But I thought she was very good at telling the story and doing that transition. So this is her Magid. Of course, Magid from Haggadah is the storytelling. Haggadah, the story, the Agadah. That is what we do on Pesach. And Magid, if you go through your set order of the Seder, you know, Magid, what is it? Magid Rachsa Motzi Matzah as one of the orders. You tell the story, then you break the matzah, wash your hands, the whole thing. So her poem is telling a story, and it is telling a story out of Egypt, but her story is a story of leaving. So the courage to let go of the door, the handle, the courage to shed the familiar walls whose very stains and leaks are comfortable as the little moles of the upper arm. Stains that recall a feast, a child's naughtiness, a loud blattering storm that slapped the roof hard, pouring through. The courage to abandon the graves dug into the hill, the small bones of children and the brittle bones of the old whose marrow hunger had stolen. The courage to desert the tree planted and only begun to bear. The riverside where promises were shaped, the street where their empty pots were broken. The courage to leave the place whose language you learned as early as your own, whose customs, however dangerous or demeaning, bind you like a halter you've learned to pull inside, to move your load. The land fertile with the blood spilled on it, the roads mapped and annotated for survival. The courage to walk out of the pain that is known into the pain that cannot be imagined, mapless, walking into the wilderness, going barefoot with a canteen into the desert, stuffed in the stinking hold of a rotting ship, sailing off the map into dragons' mouths, Cathay, India, Siberia, Golden Medina, leaving bodies by the way like abandoned treasure. So they walked out of Egypt. So they bribed their way out of Russia under loads of straw. So they steamed out of the bloody, smoking charnel house of Europe and overloaded freighters forbidden all ports. Out of pain into death or freedom, or a different painful dignity, into squalor and politics. We Jews are all born of wanderers, with shoes under our pillows and a memory of blood that is ours raining down. We honour only those Jews who changed tonight, those who chose the desert over bondage, who walked into the strange and became strangers, and gave birth to children who could look down on them, standing on their shoulders for having been slaves. We honour those who let go of everything but freedom, who ran, who revolted, who fought, who became other by saving themselves. I can see some of you on the screen are very emotional, and this makes me emotional too. It's very different, isn't it, from that light joy, I hold heaven in my hand, or a simple what it takes to cross, because this is the cost of it. It's what it means to be a refugee. There's a poet, non-Jewish poet Warsan Shire, who wrote a poem that has become kind of anthem for refugees in our country. About 15 years ago, and it says you only leave home if home was the mouth of a shark. That's the only reason you would get into the small boats and leave, is if home itself was the shark. But I couldn't help thinking here, what Marge Piercy is saying is almost the opposite. It's you've left home that is the seemingly safe place, even though it is shark-like and going to destroy you. And where you're sailing to is also dragon's mouths. You have no idea what it is you're sailing into and how dangerous it is or isn't. So that kind of courage, the memory of the blood and the stepping into the new land, choosing freedom is wonderful, but at what cost? And I think there's something very pointed here, right? Who walked into the strange and became strangers. That generation of immigrants who still spoke the original language and maybe found, let's say, English hard, and gave birth to children who could look down on them. The only reason that generation could look down on the generation before is because they're standing on their shoulders. And I thought it was a very brilliant thing to do. So I wanted to do this. I wanted to honour Marge Piercy, but also kind of think about that cost. But Cathay and India, Siberia, Golden and Medina, what were they coming to? It's not necessarily how we culturally celebrate Pesach anymore. So let me go to Marjorie Morningstar as promised. Okay, so I've got a little bit from the movie and a little bit from the book. Both include the Seder scene. It was the first film to have a Seder scene in it, but the Seder scene is very abbreviated. In the book, it is a very, very lengthy chapter. In the scene, it is quite brief. But what it plays out, really, is that we have these two Jews, Marjorie Morgenstern, and Noel Airman. Of course, that is an adaptation, Airman. He is a pilot, but it's also his parents' name is Herman, Ehrman. And he is one of those children who's standing on the shoulders, or rather his parents, who are now a judge, and his wife, who are about to leave the Seder to go to a Democratic Party fundraiser. They are the ones standing on the shoulders, but looking down on the immigrant generation. Whereas Marjorie Morningstar's family, although they've moved to the Upper West Side of New York, are absolutely clinging to the traditions and celebrating their Jewishness kind of in their lives and behaviour. And that debate about the relationship, can love conquer all, is actually really a debate about two different kinds of Jewish future. Yes, it's about feminism and misogyny and all those things too, but within it, the kind of Seder is the central scene to highlight all those questions around assimilation, but also what are you prepared to give up? So let's do a little bit, the intro bit first. So here is Natalie Wood as Marjorie and her mother, and she's just got off the phone with Noel, and she's telling her mother, this is the one, he's the one.
You better get used to him, because he's going to be your son. You really think so? Oh, I know it. I just know it. Oh, Mother, I love him so much. As long as he's going to be in the family, ask him up to the house. Yes, Mother dear. Invite him to Passover dinner. Not Passover, Mother. Noel isn't very religious. He doesn't believe in those things. He doesn't believe in those things? You're going to get married. How are you going to raise your children? All right, Mother. I'll invite him.
Okay. So this is the kind of thing that her mother is doing to try and show Marjorie that there is a disconnect by saying invite him to Seder, because this is about how you'll raise your children. So I just want to show you a little bit from the book before I show you the Seder itself, and how the book fills in those gaps. Because it's a much more closely woven exploration than the film is of both of their Jewish identities. Okay. So when Mrs. Morgenstern first suggested inviting Noel and his parents to the family's Passover dinner, the Seder, Marjorie thought it was an appalling idea. On reflection, however, she decided there was some hard good sense in it. With Noel doing well at Paramount, with their relationship becoming each week more intimate and hopeful, it did seem to her that the time had come for his parents and her own to confront each other. This isn't just, by the way, meet the in-laws for the son. This is both sets of in-laws, prospective in-laws getting together. She also thought Noel had better see the family and glimpse her religious background. At 14 and 15, she'd hated seders, bar mitzvahs, and all the rest, and she'd taken pleasure in shocking her parents with atheistic talk. In recent years, however, she'd found the Seder oddly appealing, and she wanted to see how he would react. The complex rituals and symbols of the Passover feast, the matzah, the horseradish, the 4 cups of wine, the pounded nuts and apples, the hard-boiled eggs and salt water, the great goblet of wine for Elijah. These things, with the old family songs and the annual jokes at the same point in the Hebrew service, had attractive, bittersweet nostalgia for her. It was fun in a way too, to see the family once a year and find out which of the cousins had married and see the new babies and marvel at the rapid growth of the old babies. There was a risk, of course, that Noel and his parents would be dismayed and put off by the Seder, but she didn't think it was much of a risk, and anyway, she was prepared to take it. She was rather afraid to bring the subject up with Noel, but to her astonishment, he agreed very readily to come. He knew nothing whatever about seders, except that matzah was eaten. But when she described the ceremonies to him, he said, "Why, it sounds very colourful and alive. My father will undoubtedly make a bloody ass of himself as usual, but that might prove amusing too." Okay. So he doesn't think it's a big deal, but he thinks it will be quite amusing. What he lets himself in for, though, he hasn't understood. So here's the film, Seder. It's very short in the film.
This is the poor bread which our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat with us. Whosoever is needy, let him come and celebrate the Passover with us. This cup in the center of the table is the cup of Elijah, our missing guest. And this chair was Uncle Samson.
No, I'm sorry you were so bored.
Oh, Marjorie, I wasn't bored. I was disturbed. Deeply. Couldn't help thinking of all the things I've missed in life. Family, your kind of family. Faith, tradition, all the things I've been ridiculing all the time. That's why I couldn't take it anymore.
So this is the quintessential Gene Kelly kind of romantic heroine scene, and he's softened in the film. You know, what he's actually doing is walking out, they're opening the door for Elijah, and he's walking out of the Seder. Now, unless you know that, you don't get that from the film. But of course, Elijah is all about bringing someone in. He chooses the moment to leave. But he softens it. In the film, they don't want to ruin the romantic hero too much. So he's someone who feels too much, and that's why he can't stay. It's not quite how the book does it. So in the book, we have an absolute raucous setting. I won't read through it all, but we've got lots and lots of adults. We've got a kid, Neville, who puts a foot through a pane in the French doors. The children are on a separate table being given Pepsi Cola. I'm not sure how kosher for Pesach that is. But what happens, maybe it is, the cornstarch is removed. But what happens is that the quarrelsome chattering of the children and the howls of the babies is absolutely subdued, and like the fun goes with the adults because Judge Herman, Noel's father, comes in his finery and his wife is dressed up to the nines, and the Morgenstern family feel completely inhibited. So the liveliness did not extend to the table of adults. Here, as the ceremonies proceeded, there gradually fell a strained, queer quiet, unlike the atmosphere of other years. The little people of the family, old grey tailors, candy store keepers, mechanics and their wives, were terrorised by the presence of a judge and his lady, and their grown-up sons and daughters, usually a joking and irreverent band of ordinary young Americans, wore awkward company airs. The fact that the airmans were in evening clothes did not help matters. Tiny Uncle Schmulka, the laundry sorter, jammed in his cheap frayed brown suit against the resplendent judge, kept trying in vain to shrink away and not contaminate the great man with the rub of poverty. Seth, too, sat clumsy and glum beside Mr. Morgenstern, supporting his father's opening chants over the wine and the matzah with an uncertain baritone voice and shooting occasional suspicious looks at Noel. And you get this class inhibition. You know, I know Americans don't do class, right? But what you get is in the Jewish world, they very much do. I'm always being told by American friends that class is an English thing. But what we see is it's absolutely not. And I think Philip Roth will go on to kind of pull apart a little bit of this in Westchester and Newark as well. Um, Noel tries to behave, but he makes the family even more uneasy. You can see a chill radiated him, causing much of the lameness of the singing, the stumbling of the Hebrew responses, and the embarrassed side glances among the relatives. The skull cap perched on his thick blonde hair somehow looked as incongruous if it would have on an animal's head. His bearing was sober, his comments courteous. Marjorie could not accuse him of deliberately trying to appear out of place and trapped, and nor was there anything intentionally offensive in the way he kept looking around. But the effect was to make the family, including Marjorie, feel increasingly like painted Africans performing a voodoo rite. Okay. And it goes on and on and on. I won't go into it in more depth because I'm very aware of time and I want to give a little bit of time for questions. But can you see the difference if you unpack the book and you unpack the film? You know, what is a romantic heroine story in the film and quite frothy about women coming of age in America is absolutely a study of Jewish family life in the book and that real detailed unpicking of what happens when generations assimilate or don't assimilate or find different ways to be Jewish. And I thought that kind of comment about his presence, and of course, the Airmans are Jewish too, they're just totally assimilated, but they make the observant Jews feel like painted Africans performing a voodoo rite. I mean, probably in a sensitivity read nowadays, that line would get struck out, but it absolutely conjures up the kind of exoticizing that is happening. And I keep going back to the Marge Pierce's kind of those who stand on our shoulders look down on us kind of feeling. Now, I was going to contrast it, but I'm going to save it to another day with Woody Allen because I don't know if any of you know Crimes and Misdemeanors. Brilliant film. And in it, the Seder scene becomes not just a moment of nostalgia and consideration of the Holocaust, but a kind of centre of morality. So it's the kind of very opposite feeling rather than being dated. It's kind of what brings them back to life. But I do want to end with Israel. So I'm going to say, go watch Crimes and Misdemeanors on your own or invite me another year and we'll take that apart. But just so you know, Woody Allen, the secular Jew, actually does a mean Pesach Seder. Um, but I will take us on because what I really want to finish with is Israel, because I'm very aware of giving us meaning. I want this session, yes, to be a romp through kind of literary and cultural Pesach poems and stories, but I think we've got to take something meaningful from it for our moment in time. So I've brought you a poem, and then I'm going to end by playing you a song. So the poem is actually before that, what I wanted to just show you was Ben Gurion's speech, which leads into the poem. So I had us in Israel on the moon also at that moment of the creation of the state. So I don't know if you know that David Ben Gurion's speech to the UN Commission pulled out the Pesach reference and America. So 300 years ago, there came to the New World a boat, and its name was the Mayflower. Okay. How many people were on it? Who were their leaders? What kind of food did they eat on the boat? He goes, but what does he do? He contrasts it with the Exodus. Okay. More than 3,300 years ago, long before the Mayflower, our people left Egypt, and every Jew in the world, wherever he is, knows what day they left, and he knows what food they ate. And we still eat that food every anniversary, and we know who our leader was. And we sit down and tell the story to our children and grandchildren in order to guarantee that it will never be forgotten. And we say our slogan, now we may be enslaved, but next year we'll be a free people. Okay. 1947 at the UN. Kind of, this is the Bashana Habab Yerushalayim, you know, at its most kind of like that is the moment for it. So what I wanted to show you is the Yehuda Amichai riff off that, because you'll see I came to the promised land by sea within the poem. And I think it references back to the moon, the lunar year, but it also takes us into that place that I think we all are at this moment, caught between the Seder, between our Jewish tradition, those 3,000 years of Jewish history, our feelings around Israel as a safe place in a nation state, but also the tension of current world events, the kind of mouth of the shark or mouth of the dragons, that feeling of what pain is being caused as well, you know, where we leave, where we live. You know, here is an Israeli who still has inside him the mad search for emergency exits, which feels to me like that's the story of the shelters and, you know, right now. So this is I Wasn't One of the 6 Million by Amichai. I wasn't one of the 6 million who died in the Shoah. I wasn't even among the survivors. And I wasn't one of the 600,000 who went out of Egypt. I came to the Promised Land by sea. No, I was not in that number, though I still have the fire and the smoke within me, pillars of fire and pillars of smoke that guide me by night and by day. I still have inside me the mad search for emergency exits, for soft places, for the nakedness of the land, for the escape into weakness and hope. I still have within me the lust to search for living water, with quiet talk to the rock, or with frenzied blows. Afterwards, silence. No questions, no answers. Jewish history and world history grind me between them like two grindstones, sometimes to a powder. And the solar year and the lunar year get ahead of each other or fall behind, leaping. They set my life in perpetual motion. Sometimes I fall into the gap between them to hide or to sink all the way down. I mean, I just thought for me, that is the moment we're living in right now. You know, our two worlds are getting ahead of each other or falling behind. We are in perpetual motion. And sometimes that gap is where we find our home, where we hide. You know, it's the crack in the rock in which we see God's face. But sometimes that disconnection is where we sink. So we've got 5 minutes. I want to play Chava Alberstein, but I know there'll be questions. So what I'm going to suggest is this. I give us 5 minutes for questions, and then we play ourselves out with Chava Alberstein afterwards. And those who want to stay and listen can, and those who don't can leave. So let me stop sharing for a minute, and Callie, pass over to you.
Huh, pass over to me. Nice.
Exactly.
Okay. So we do have some questions. And again, if you have one, please put it in the chat. We'll start with you were talking about assimilation and the portrayals that you showed, specifically the assimilated Jews are often played by non-Jewish actors. Why do you think that is? And we would like to think that that has changed, but as you can see in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Patty LuPone, also not Jewish. So why do you think that that continues to be a trope we see in media?
Okay, so although Tova Feldshuh, who is the mother and who has the most significant role, absolutely is, I agree, and I'm actually very, very torn. I mean, this kind of debate really came into its own on kind of actually in September, October 2023, just before 7th of October took everything else over, because that was when the Golda Meir movie came out, and Golda Meir was
Mhm.
played by Helen Mirren. Okay. And there was parts of me that was very frustrated with that. Um, in fact, there's an actress I'm very close to in the UK. Her name is Maureen Lipman, or Dame Maureen Lipman. And she wrote a kind of excoriating thing about why are non-Jews taking the Jewish parts and Jew face and everything else. The truth is, though, Maureen could never have played that role, and Helen Mirren, in some ways, did transform. And an actor's role is to transform. What I found with that movie, and I think overall, is for me, it's not always about the actors. You know, the acting is about transformation, and I wouldn't want Jews not to get to play non-Jewish roles. And what's happened equally, and I don't know if it's happening there, but for my friends here trying to get on the West End stage, the only roles they get now are in Jewish plays, which are few and far between because of that kind of identity casting. So I'm very wary of saying we've got to cast by type. I think for me though, writing and direction has to be. So for me, that movie was written. I'm using it just as one example, but it was written by a non-Jew. It was directed by an Israeli, so that there was something that came in there. But the fact that it was scripted by a non-Jew and non-Israeli, for me, was why it felt not right. Like it didn't get the atmosphere correct. So I would say I want the people making the productions. First of all, I want a lot more Jewish content out there. I think it's really important we see ourselves reflected. But to me, it's more important that the people writing and creating direct the Jews. And you know that they portray it correctly. And you saw the Herman Wouk portrayal is so much more
Mhm.
complex, right? Um, and I think that was because of the fear in Hollywood. You know, one last example, but I've been teaching a lot of Streisand recently, and she was mentioned at the beginning. So she went to her um, agent to try and get Yentl made. So when Yentl's script arrived at her door, the first version, it was sent to her by a producer named Valentine Sherry, and she said, I want to do this. Like she immediately wanted to do it. And her agent, David Begelman, Jewish, said, you've just played a Jewish girl. You can't play a Jewish boy on screen. It's going to pigeonhole you. Um, and he wouldn't let her do it. And then Universal didn't want to make it. And she fought for 14 years and invested a lot of her own money to get it made. Maybe it's not the best ever singer Yentl, but it is still a very Jewish story. So I think it's interesting though there that it was the non-Jewish world going, this wouldn't be commercial to represent Jews, but it was also the Jewish agent terrified of pigeonholing an actor or actress. So I think it's, anyway, all that is to say it's complex, but I hope it answers your question.
Yes, obviously I'm a Jewish actor, and so I will find the Maureen Lipman piece and put it in the post program email as it went very viral in my community. Um, but speaking of the Herman Wouk portrayal, well, yes, it was more complex. When you were reading it, you were seeing terms like skullcap, not kippah or yarmulke. So, who is the desired audience for this, and how has that shifted from the book to the movie?
Yeah. So my favorite is when tefillin gets translated as phylacteries. Like, how much more accessible is that going to be? Um, so the movie kind of thins it out. So you don't get the world of references, but it simplifies it. Like the Wook does that thing, which I know every copy editor does. I'm constantly thinking about it as we do the magazine. Do we transliterate? Do we translate? Which transliteration? Which terms are we using terms that only work for Ashkenazi Jews or Sephardi Jews? Like it is a complex thing. And I think it's one of those moments for of Amichai's like the gaps between the two worlds really show something. All I would say is when you're looking particularly at translations of Hebrew and Yiddish, it is fascinating who translates the terms and who doesn't. What you're going to see with Chad Gadya in a moment that I'll play us out with is Chava Alberstein is originally from Poland. She's singing Chad Gadya, which is Aramaic in our Seder. And then the second half of the song is she takes it into modern Ivrit. So
Mm.
she goes other, that kind of crossover or translation. That's literally what, again, Ivri, we are people who translate, who carry across. So the translator has kept Chad Gadya so she's translated all into the English, but the first version she did, she kept the Chad Gadya in the Aramaic and then just translated the Hebrew into the English. Then she did a version, and I've stolen it from YouTube, and because that way you've got the subtitles on the screen very easily as it sings. But you'll see it's all in English. But in doing that, unless she throws in words like zazim, you don't get the sense that half of it is Aramaic and half a new song at all. But then hilariously, she's put next to kid, my father bought a kid. She's put in brackets every time goat. Like we'd be really terrified that a non-Jew would read it and think that we were selling and buying real children. So it's all about audience, right?
And then, sorry, my last question is going to be, why do you think that Passover isn't portrayed more in literary and media sources, whereas Hanukkah, which is also sort of connected to a more mainstream holiday, is?
because Hanukkah's at Christmas time and it's a festival of lights. And that, again, isn't that an interesting mistranslation into the assimilated world? And it's not often just done by non-Jews, but also by us, because they're the same time of year, because they're a connection with lights. People go Hanukkah is the Jewish Christmas. And I'm always explaining that Passover with that family gathering, telling a story, is much more the moment, probably the two things even very assimilated Jews do is Pesach and maybe Yom Kippur. You know, I remember when I was 19, I was at Berkeley, which was eye-opening. I'd come from a very traditional English Jewish family, fully Shomer Shabbat, Shomer Kashrut. Next door to me was an Israeli couple, and they invited me for Rosh Hashanah and served honey glazed ham, which of course I wouldn't touch. But I was like, what is this? This was their Israeli little nod to Rosh Hashanah. But even that couple did Pesach Seder. So there is something I think which is about the intergenerationality in the family. But I agree. I think we need many more depictions of it in the non-Jewish world, so people understand us, understand what a chaotic and interesting mess we are in all the questions that we ask, right?
Well, with that, I'm going to leave it to Chagalia to take us out. I will put every poem that was mentioned into the post-program email, so do not worry. And I'll say goodbye to you now. Thank you so much to Aviva, and I hope everyone has an amazing rest of their Passover.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me, Callie, and all of you. But also, we're in Chol HaMoed, so the traditional greeting for this moment is Moedim L'Simcha, may we increase in joy. So I'm going to play us out on a kind of sad note, but actually my real wish for us is that there be an increase in joy. So Moedim L'Simcha, Chagim Uzmanim L'Sason. And here is Chava Alberstein's Chad Gadya. And by the way, just to say, so it was banned from broadcast at the time. She wrote it during the Lebanon War in 89, and then it was banned from being played. And now it is absolutely a fixture in pre-Pesach Israel. So things do move on and change. Here we go.
We can't hear it yet, but I'm sure it's coming.
doch مسافر بهافرجا بعد خطوة الدراب بدبي بيك وضع في الهوى كلب نشاط لقطوش الدراب بدبي شافين إذا بينا باب درجس قد قديا Aviva Pesach ומה משתנה משתנה, אני השתניתי השנה. ובכל הלילות, בכל הלילות, שאלתי אחר כך מפתיע, הלילה הזה להיות סלע, הלילה הזה להיות סלע, הלילה
Thanks, everyone. Morim Laksimcha.